According to the Federal Roads Maintenance Agency, over 80% of travels in Nigeria are carried out on the roads, with about 90% of that being largely federal roads. But only about 10,000 kilometers of federal roads are in good state. About 13,300 kilometers are in fair state, while 11,600 kilometers are bad. On this week's episode of the program, my guest speaks about the challenges of maintaining the nation's road network. Hello again, thank you for joining us on Dateline Abuja. I'm Ibrahim Adra. Beyond being the seat of power, the Federal Capital Territory offers several business opportunities to private investors. The Minister of FCT, Malam Mohammed Bello, is promising to create a business-friendly environment in Abuja. We have more details in the FCT in Focus segment. While in the interview segment, the Managing Director of the Federal Roads Maintenance Agency, Engineer Nuruddin Rafindadi, speaks about the state of the roads across the country. Let's begin this conversation by going back to last year, and specifically looking at the Stakeholders Forum. One of the recommendations that came out of that forum is the development of a strategic plan. Now, the thinking I gathered then was to be able to rehabilitate major economic routes in the country. I'd like to ask you, where are we on those at the moment?
Well, in essence, that has really been part of the strategic approach to our job. If you look at the federal highway network, it consists of various trunks that we call arterials. Trunk A1, trunk A2, trunk A3. These trunks are designated to serve specific purposes. There are arterials that connect the north to the southern part of the country for the purpose of delivering import goods into the country and evacuating export goods outside the country, but in general also general movement of goods and services between the north and the south. There are arterials that connect between the east and the west, and there are arterials that target specific agricultural producing areas. That is how we grade our highways. They are all part of the Federal Highway Network, and we prioritize the attention given to them based on the volume that flows through them and the specific sectors of the economy that they serve. So that has always been the case when we are doing our condition survey and work plan. Other factors include the condition of the road, how bad it is. Another factor is the time of the year. At the end of the year, there are roads that gain special significance because of their role in the mass movement of people during the ember month period, the end of the year, the holiday period. And particularly, attention is drawn then to all the highways and corridors that deliver people and goods to the eastern corridor, because there's a large movement of people and goods to and from the east, both from the north and from the west, but going with target to the east. And there are key arterials that serve this purpose. So that is the strategic plan that we were talking about, and that is the special emphasis that was given to it at that time. For instance, in the end of this year, end of 2019, we got into high gear addressing that strategy as it concerns the end of the year movement.
All right, let's look at another recommendation that came from that, the need for approved national transport policy. You remember that, as well as road transport policy, to show direction and mirror the realities of the time, as it were. Now, do you think this policy would in any way make a difference? Is it making any difference?
It will definitely make a difference, because when you talk of transport, you are talking of a global sense of anything that has to do with transporting goods and services from point to point in the country. And it's not only road transport that plays a role in that. There is railways, there is waterways, and there is aviation. And this government in particular has been unique in the sense that it has paid escalated attention to certain aspects, has certain modes of transport that had not previously gotten attention. I'm talking particularly about the rail network. The present rail network is being designed and planned in a way that will play its own role in the intermodality of the transport sector. So what it says is that you cannot develop roads in isolation. You have to consider where is it taking off and where is it delivering. So if we have inland river port, you have to address the roads that evacuate goods that are coming to the inland river ports, and also delivering to the inland river port. When you are, for instance, designing roads and bridges, you have to talk to inland waterways so that you are sure that the bridges and their clearances do not obstruct flow of water transport. So those are the things that are required in a transport policy. We do not as yet have a final implemented transport policy, but I know that this government is working in that direction. I will just say two things, for instance. One is we know that there was a bill that was actually enacted as law for the National Transport Commission, and the function of that National Transport Commission is to be the regulator of the transport sector. That is now enacted, and there's an act in existence that has created a National Transport Commission that will regulate transport in all its ramifications, whether it is particularly roads and rails and waterways. There is another bill in the National Assembly that is geared towards road sector reform. And the road sector reform will contain, among other things, the creation of a federal roads authority and the creation of National Roads Fund. And I know that we are active participants and advocates for that policy. And we know that policy is right now in the National Assembly.
You cannot talk about roads or any government project indeed without talking about funding. And that is a major problem across board. Now, how much of that is a problem for FRMA as an agency?
I think that in FRMA, that is a key problem. And we are not talking only, in FRMA, we are not talking only of having huge amounts or sufficient funds to do our programs of road maintenance and road management, but the timeliness of the funding, the structure of the funding, and how does it come, the sustainability of the funding. And so that's why, if you remember, during that stakeholders forum, we were particularly talking about an enabling provision in the FAMAS Act that specifies that 5% of the pricing template of petroleum products, specifically AGO and PMS, would be committed to roads maintenance. And out of that commitment, 40% comes to the federal agency and 60% goes to the state-run road maintenance agencies. Now, that is a structure that is meant to acknowledge that maintenance of the federal highway network cannot be a burden that is squarely on the federal budget. And then the 100% of that is gotten from the line items in a similar way as you get all the funding for the social sectors. There is a realization that road is an infrastructure that is an enabler to the economy. It's an economic activity, not always a social provision. And there are roads in Nigeria that can sustain themselves, that can actually even generate funding to sustain other roads that are less so able to do so. And one of the conclusions then was to push and support for the Roads Sector Reform Act in the sense that it addresses this structure of funding. Of course, there will continue to be funding from the federal budget, but we all know that the federal budget is insufficient. What the federal budget can provide for the road sector, it will always be insufficient because of the simple fact that there are so many other competing and sometimes even more sensitive needs on the budget.
So perhaps that simply creates the need for thinking out of the box, coming up with ideas. Does FRMA, in its wisdom, have you thought of any funding sources away from what we just talked about?
There are many possibilities of funding sources, but you have to bear in mind that you have to talk about the legislative origin of FEMA. You have to take a look at the Act of FEMA. How much of a leeway does the Act give to FEMA to go out, for instance, and get international interventions, sovereign loans, or go into debt or equity partnership with investors locally and internationally? The present Act of FEMA as it is does not quite give us all that ability. The tolling policy of the road sector in Nigeria is actually housed in the Ministry of Works. The Ministry of Works is the party responsible for rolling out the tolling policy. Of course, FEMA will then implement it or even delegate that function from the Ministry of Works. So the whole idea of road sector reform is to place this the tools for the ability to do that in an agency that has that responsibility. And we are looking then at the fact that you have road assets across the country that have various estimates been estimated of 6 or 8 trillion naira. This is the assets we have of roads and bridges in Nigeria are worth more than, I would say, perhaps more than what the assets of ports. These are assets that are economic enablers, like I said. There are investors that realize the potential of using these assets to make business, to move economies. And therefore, there has to be an enabling environment that suits the policy and the legal and institutional framework to enable the investor know exactly how to come in and how to get out. Investors will come in to invest on roads, not because they are social service NGOs, but because they are here to make business, and they realize that it makes good business, for instance, to invest in huge infrastructure like the major bridges and the major roads. And it will just be like similar to the telecom sector. You know, there are many years ago when telecom was being funded just like a social service, but today it is one of the major movers of the economy. We believe that an infrastructure like roads, among others, has the ability to generate enough for the economy and for sustaining the roads themselves.
When you were talking about that structure, you did mention the states. It brings to mind the mere fact that, look, this is a task that everyone has to be on board. So I'm wondering, what is the level and the quality of collaboration between FRMA as an agency and the state governments on the one hand, and even federal ministries towards achieving this huge task you have ahead of you?
Yes, well, just to be sure, FRMA as it is today is just a federal maintenance agency. It's not yet a federal roads authority. The difference is that the federal roads authority will take custody of the federal highway network and will have that asset available to it to leverage and get some other finances. It will have the mandate and the authority to do that. But talking about collaboration now with the state governments, we have an active collaboration with the states that do have roads authorities. And to be sure, not all the states have roads maintenance authorities. We have road maintenance agencies in Kogi, in Katsina, in Kano, in Lagos, quite a few states, and they are really quite active. And wherever we collaborate with them, we get big synergy advantage, because whenever you partner with the state road agencies, you have advantages of sharing skills, sharing knowledge, sharing community actions, and even participating jointly in our roads. They do have their own plans and machineries. They have their own mandates from the state government. They have advantage that they are in closer touch with the communities. And those kind of things help us a lot in doing road maintenance.
And Nuruddin Rafandadi, on that very positive note, I would like to thank you again for speaking with us.
Thank you very much.